We are now recording, indeed. Okay. Yeah, the synoptic class is large. Again, that's where everyone's kind of got to now, isn't it? So, you know, we'll continue to run these events, I think. So, welcome to you, Victoria. So, as I say, we're recording now. We'll kick the event off. I've taken the waiting room off so people can get in and out. So, session 2 in a series of 9. Revolving around on a cyclical basis. So it could be your first, it could be your 8th, it could be your 58th, depending how many times you want to attend these things. Today's session is focused on the content of task 5 of the MMAC assessment. It follows on from the activities that we did last week. I recognise most names anyway, so hopefully, you know, you can recall where we were last week. If you're first in today, you know, and it's the first session, so let me know if you've not got recordings of last week, and of course I can let you have those. And then when you watch the recording of this one through, it will be a seamless join of 2 tasks. Task 4, task 5, really revolving around the management accounting. Okay, could this come up in a synoptic? Yes, the principle could easily be examined in questions in a synoptic. So yeah, absolutely. I think certainly from here, the concepts of absorption costing, marginal costing, decision making, the absorption process that we have there, any of those things would be relevant at the end of the day. Victoria, yeah, can you just drop me an email? So look, if you've not already got it, you should have my email address anyway on the registration link, but just drop me an email to this email address here. Let me know what you need. And then, because I'll lose the text box after this evening, but if you pop it in the email, I will be able to deal with that at some point tomorrow. Okay, so I can give you some links to the previous recordings. Certainly session 1 leads straight into this one. Okay, so yeah, give it a look. Okie dokie, right. We'll follow exactly the same process that we've had every week for those that have been here for several weeks. And that is, we are going to have a little chat around some background data. I'll just make that bigger for the purposes of our discussion. A little bit of background data about the principles of the content of the task. And then we have a go at some tasks. Now, again, if this is your first week and you may not have received the tasks that we sent out for this week, don't worry, sit back, relax, it's being recorded. So you can have a look at it afterwards. You'll get a link to the recording and then you should be receiving thereafter the tasks through the email system. But let me know if there's anything missing. Please check your spam, your filters. If you think you should have had something, just check those first, because sometimes they do get sort of pulled out by filters. So yeah, right, here we go. Last week we talked about absorption costing as a general principle, and we looked at and we talked about this diagram that we have on the screen. The idea that we're trying to work out the cost of producing a unit of whatever it is we are producing and whatever it is we are choosing to measure as a basis, i.e. the cost unit. So let's stick with simple stuff. So we're trying to work out the cost of making a widget or something like this. Now, don't ask me what a widget is. It's just one of those things. It's a sort of nondescript generic thing. Maybe we'll use some other terminology, some other examples, because sometimes I use some weird things, which sometimes people like in terms of visualizing the problem. So down at the bottom here, we're trying to work out the cost of producing, manufacturing stuff. Maybe not manufacturing businesses, all of them, but yeah, it's what we do. So what's the cost of what we make? What's the cost of what we do? And we talked last week about direct costs, costs which can be traced directly to the cost unit. So in a manufacturing sense, the raw materials being used, the direct labor costs, where again, we can see the amount of time someone spends doing a job. And therefore, the direct cost, not a problem. They go straight into the cost of the unit, the stuff that we're producing. The great excitement last week was about these indirect costs. Okay, what's the other word we talk about when we say indirect costs? What's the word I'm looking for in that chat panel there, ladies and gentlemen? I'm looking for a word beginning with O. Rosie's on it. And yeah, it's a word beginning with O, and it's a word ending in verheads. Love it. Overheads, it is. Rosie, Claudine, she's in there, Elena's in it, Valerie's in it. Fantastic. And I give shout outs to as many people as I can for your participation in the chat panel. Super. Okay. So when we're talking about overheads, not all, but most of these are fixed, of course. We're talking about the rent, the rates, the insurance, all of this kind of stuff. And last week's session, as a reminder, last week's session looked at basically this process here, which was taking those overheads, allocating them if we knew which centre they related to, apportioning them or sharing them if they were multi-centre amongst the different production and service centres, so the different areas of our business. We talked last week about these two being effectively, in this illustration, our manufacturing or production centres. So the units that we are producing physically pass through here. That's the kind of thing to think about. And then, of course, there was other things like the canteen, service centres, maybe not canteens. It could be the maintenance department. It could be a stores department and all of those kind of things, where the idea, of course, is that the service centres are providing a service to these other centres here. So we've allocated, we apportioned last week. We then reapportioned, because when we want to work out the cost of something that we're producing, the thing that we're producing passes through the assembly and through the painting. And so as it passes through assembly and painting, we need to absorb some of the cost into the units passing through it. Now, you may recall last week, and I know some people like the visual of it. I referred, I think last week, correct me if I'm wrong, but last week, assembly was something like a tub of flour, and painting was like a big bucket of batter. And we were talking about the principle of going down your local chippy, ordering some fish, freshly cooked. And the fryer, the man, the lady that does the cooking, takes a fish. The fish is one of the things that we're producing, okay? Takes the fish and dabs it into the flour, you know, lays that fish in the flour, turns it over. And what happens when they pick it up? I wish I had a piece of fish to do it with. When they pick that piece of fish up, it's got flour on it. Do you know what's happened there? It's absorbed some overhead. Oh! Then, of course, they move it to the next bucket and they then dip it into the batter. Great. And I'm sort of wiggling it in the batter here. They lift it up and now it's got some batter hanging on it. That's what's happened there then, isn't it? So our unit of production has dipped itself in assembly. It's dipped itself in painting. And it comes out the other side with not just the cost of the fish, but it has absorbed some assembly and some painting. Valerie, apologies. I know that I'm using something here which, yeah, is probably not good for you. Therefore, I should be on a slimming plan. Wednesdays, I've moved to the countryside in the village. On Wednesdays, we get a truck comes round, a little fish and chip van. So I'm going to go and ask him tomorrow to do me some freshly cooked stuff. And I'm going to say to him as he's doing it, do you know you're absorbing some overhead there? And that will be very exciting, won't it? Because he won't have a clue what I'm talking about. Yeah, indeed, smiley face. Okay, so look, that was last week. And so if you want, if you're not sure about what I'm talking about, look back. But that was the sort of visualization that we had of the process. So this week, we're talking about Task 5. Task 5 is about this process of actually dipping it in. The first task that we saw last week then is getting the buckets and the tubs full of the cost, or if you like, full of the flour and full of the batter. That's what we did last week. This week, the fish is going to dip in, and out it comes with all of the overhead absorbed onto it. Oh, and then it becomes fried with lots of lovely chips. Oh, fantastic. Great. So how do we do this then? So look, I'm just going to do a bit of scribbling. So I will disappear shortly now because I need to lay my laptop down so I can scribble on it. However, you know, great, there's a photograph there if you want to look at it, but it's better than looking up my nose. So here we go, video just going off now, so I can lay this down. There we go. Oh, I've just broken the stand it's on. Oh dear, never mind. Let's hope it. If you hear a crash, you know what it is. So when we've got the flour in the tub, we've got the batter in the bucket, if you like. What we need to do, and we typically will do this, you know, at the end of the day, as a sort of a budget. So in a minute, down on these notes, we mention it's a predetermined. So generally, we will budget what we think we need to absorb. Okay, and we work out ultimately a budgeted overhead absorption rate. How much flour sticks on the fish? How much batter sticks on the fish? That kind of thing. Now, of course, let's stop talking about batter and flour and fish, and let's think about costs which have been allocated and apportioned into our production cost centers. So how much of that cost are they going to absorb? Well, we calculate an absorption rate, which at the end of the day is the amount of overhead cost that's found its way into the different production centers. And we will absorb it on a basis of activity. So, you know, we've got to spread out, divide that overhead cost amongst all of the things going on, as it were. Okay, now when we talk about basis of activity, you know, bear in mind that there are simple ways of doing it, which is just to say, well, how many units do we produce? How many units go through, how many pieces of fish go through the flour tub? How many pieces of fish go through the batter? Or, of course, how many units go through the painting division? How many units go through the whatever it is, the metal bending division, or whatever they want to create? Now, doing it on a unit basis is relatively simple, it's relatively obvious, but it is generally only relevant or appropriate to do that if everything that we produce is identical. So, you know, we might produce, and I'm going to use my fish and chips. We're going to say, look, okay, fair enough. We could just say per fish, if all we did was pieces of cod. But if you've got plaice and you've got hake and you've got rockfish, which are all sort of different things, well, actually, there'll be different amount of flour for a rockfish and different amounts of batter compared to a cod. If I turn that into, you know, more MMAC speak, what we might find is that the different products that we produce have different amounts of, let's say in order here, different amounts of labor input. So people are working on one of our products for a lot longer than they are on other products. So, you know, if you like, they spend more time in a labor sense in one of those divisions, one of those cost centers. Marvelous. Now, I'm not going to try and use fish for that one, but nonetheless, you know, we're talking about if we identify that what we make is very labor intensive, it's the main thing is the amount of time that people spend on it, then given that the different products have different amounts of time, but time that people spend working on it is the main factor, then what we might do is absorb the flour, absorb the batter, lift it up into production based on how long basically they are in that process. And so we might do it per labor hour. So it's not per piece of fish, you know, it's per how long it spends in the flour tub, how long it spends in the batter tub. And you know, labor hours, logical if it's a labor intensive product and we've got different products using different amounts of labor. Just makes sense, doesn't it? You know, apples with apples and all of that stuff. If we're talking about having a capital intensive automated production, you know what I mean, in terms of cars going down a production line and all those robots doing this, that and the other. Well, different types of car are likely to have different robot times included on their production. And so how much overhead gets absorbed into cars is not necessarily per car, but based on how many hours the robots are working on it. Okay, so again, there, you know, for capital intensive, automated, machinery driven stuff, maybe the number of hours of robot time is the right way to do it. Okay. And so, you know, they might ask you that as a question, you know, when would it be appropriate to use each of these? Well, obviously, the labour hours, labour intensive, machine hours is capital intensive. The per unit thing is probably the least obvious. But of course, what we're saying there is if we produce 3 things and they are all kind of identical in terms of the amount of time, the amount of machinery, you know, you can't really distinguish anything about them, then, you know, per unit is fine. Per thing going through is absolutely fine. But that's perhaps rare. And again, you know, it might be that you've got a single product. Well, if there's only one thing that you produce, you might as well just do it per thing that you produce. Again, hopefully you see what the relevance of that is. Great, superb. Let's move on. So as I said, you will normally predetermine this. You will use your budgeted figures. So all of that stuff we did last week was all based on budgets. And we ended up with a, you know, a pot full of stuff in the assembly, a pot full of stuff in painting. And, you know, great, fantastic. These were based on budgets. And therefore, again, you would not only budget the costs, but you'd also budget your activity level. And so you'll see there, this predetermined overhead absorption rate, it's exactly the same. It's the overhead cost, but it's budgeted, compared to the activity level. So how many machine hours, how many labor hours, how many units, again, based on a budgeted level of activity. Okay. And that is ostensibly, you know, how things work, isn't it? We have a budget. Now, for, again, I hope understanding the ultimate process, but without it necessarily being, let's say, strictly accurate, just imagine then that if we've got this budgeted overhead absorption rate, what is going to happen is we're going to have a management accountant who is basically going to do some double entry for absorption. Okay, and is going to, in effect, every time, and if the basis of activity is, let's say, labour hours, so let's say we're going on labour hours, the management accountant is going to watch the labour hours that we undertake. And for every hour, you know, every hour, they are going to absorb, i.e., put a cost into their management accounts based on, remember what we said up here, an overhead absorption rate. So it might be, I'm making it up, you know, £5 per labour hour. So great. So every hour that maybe the, you know, things are happening in the production term, well, let's stick with the things that we had over here. So for every labour hour in assembly, the management accountant is absorbing this cost, adding it to the cost of production. And for painting, again, if it's labour hours, for every labour hour that actually happens in the painting division, the management accountant is going to do some double entry, absorbing into the cost of production £5 per labour hour, or whatever the relevant numbers are. Okay. Now, this will not necessarily then equate, because it was based on budgets, this won't necessarily equate, will it, to the actual amount of overheads that arise. So we thought we knew what the rent was going to be, but we didn't get it right. We thought we knew what the rates were going to be, but we didn't quite get it right. And all of these things. We didn't quite get the salaries of supervisors are correct in our budgets. And so whilst the management accountant is sitting there absorbing overheads, yeah, the actual activity multiplied by the overhead absorption rate, as I was just describing, in the P&L is going a cost of production based on an estimated figure originally. And of course, as a result, because the absorbed overheads probably do not therefore equal the actual overhead, then we'll need an adjustment. Okay, we'll need an adjustment in respect of that. Okay, we'll worry about that in a minute. But the position of actually absorbing and putting in a cost based on a predetermined overhead absorption rate, and therefore ending up with a figure that is not exactly what the actual overhead was, is a process giving rise to what we call over or under absorption. Okay, and so the management accountant using budgeted figures could put too much in, or the management accountant using the budgeted figure, the overhead absorption rate, could put too little in. Okay, and I think the words and the description should be fairly self-explanatory. And so if we put, we put too much in, okay, so this is where, what you've absorbed based on the predetermined data is bigger than actual. That's too much. You've over absorbed. Okay, so the management accountant has sat there and theoretically has accounted for more flour and batter than we actually did have. And we call that over absorption. Okay, and that's a process of actual versus a predetermined budgeted rate. Of course, it could be the other way, couldn't it? And so actually what they've absorbed, of course, based on the predetermined overhead absorption rate, that could be less than the actual amount of overhead incurred. So we've absorbed too little overhead. So that's known as under absorption, which again, I don't think we should have too many problems with whether it's under or whether it's over absorbed. Okay, now I say we shouldn't, hopefully we don't. I'm not going to go too much detail into it, but because it's just a quick revision of the concept that you need to be comfortable with. Okay, so marvelous, away we go. So let's have a look at what this looks like. Forget, there's a little bit under here, I'll come back to that in a minute. So let's have a look at the tasks that are relevant for this week. Okay, now say if you haven't got these because maybe it's your first session or something and you haven't had it sent through, don't worry, just relax. You'll see it on the recording, and just let me know. We'll make sure that you are on the list for future ones. You should be, if you've had, you've registered, you are on the list to have everything sent out. So please do check your filters first. So here's example one. Broadsword has prepared budgeted overheads and activity levels, budgeted overheads and activity levels for Q1 of next year. They've got 2 production departments. They've got a plastic molding. That sounds lovely. We like a bit of plastic molding, don't we? And we've got the plastic extrusion. These are budgeted figures. You have got labor hours. You have got machine hours. And you will notice that there are budgeted amounts for both departments. Now, when you have a look at it, there's a lot more machine time than, there's a lot more labor time than machine times. So, in theory, you could argue that labor, it seems to be a particularly labor intensive process, this molding and this extrusion. Great. The budgeted overheads that get into plastic molding and extrusion are those figures there. And again, if I can just be so bold, it was task 4 that basically is about how those numbers got there. And for those, just to keep everyone, that is session 1 of our series of 9. Okay, so again, if you've not seen it, look at last week's, because we went through a big process of how to get that there. All right, so away we go. This is hopefully relatively simple, but let's check it through. It says then A, if both the plastic molding department and extrusion department are heavily automated, which is a bit contradictory to what I see there, but nonetheless, let's not worry, let's answer the question. If they were heavily automated, what would the budgeted overhead absorption rate be to 2 decimal places? Okay, now I have to ask you, when it says heavily automated, what are they telling you to use in terms of the basis of activity? just remind me of what we've just said about that. So heavily automated, the activity basis will be machine hours. I see. Excellent. Elena, lovely, superb. And she's a good. And Valerie, thank you. Superb. Machine hours. Great. Superb. Oh, here comes another one. And oh, Zara, nice. Nice. Okay, so yep, I will go in there for machine hours. Superb. This is where you have to, hopefully you've had a crack at it. So if you've got the budgeted overheads here and we're being told to use machine hours, what do you think? No worries. Shelley, when you say why would that be? When you're saying why would that be, is that a question for me there? You asked me, so why would it be? Why would it be? Why would that be? Why would that be? Machine hours, just because it's saying it's a heavily automated process. So if they say assuming, so if they were heavily automated, then the main thing is the machines are whirring round most of the time. So it's probably the best way of sucking up the overheads is to look at how long things are on the machines for. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. But as I said to you, when you look at the table, it doesn't look like machinery is the biggest thing there. All right, but you know, hey, we have to answer what they say. So I see £72.30 going up the screen. I also see £68.10 floating on there. So I see both of those. Excellent. So let's just double check it. I'll do the computations onto the side. So for the plastic molding, I'd be looking here at £130,140 of overhead budget. And I would be absorbing this on the basis of an activity level, a budgeted number of machine hours of 1,800. Great. So if I pop that into my computer, as you have done, I can see that everyone is in agreement there with £72.30. Great. £72.30p. Now, of course, it says here, doesn't it? 2 decimal places. It's in pounds. So 2 decimal places is 0.30. Make sure, of course, that you put the 0, even if your calculator doesn't have it, because if you don't have two figures after the decimal, it will mark it as wrong. And you know what I'm going to say, because I say it every week. If it tells you to do something, make sure you do it. RTFQ. Margot, thanks and good evening to you. I didn't say hello earlier, but there we go. Make sure you read these things infinitely detailed. Yeah, make sure you're not missing a trick, because 72.3 is the right answer, but it's not the right answer, of course, for them. Okay, and then the other computation, £146,415 of budgeted extrusion overhead, and that is going to be absorbed on the basis of an estimated 2,150 hours. So there's your overhead, there's the machine hours on the bottom. Plug that into your computer, and I agree with you guys that £68.10. So Claudine and Zara, and obviously Margot, she's Margot earlier, Claudine, everybody there is in agreement with that. Superb. That is exactly it. Okay. Then it says, what if, so if they were both labor intensive, well, of course, I don't need to necessarily say it, but obviously we're going to be then in this case using labor hours, which makes, you know, it feels altogether better in reality on the basis that look at the number of labor hours compared to machine hours. But there you go. And so for the second one, we're now saying alternatively, let's look at the overheads, but let's look at the activity level as a labor hours based activity level. So again, here we go, same thing. The overheads here were 130,140, and the overheads here were 146,415, same as obviously their budgeted numbers. And then we're saying, aren't we, now let's use those labor hours, that level of activity as the basis. And so correct me if I'm wrong, the table suggests that we're expecting 5,784 hours of labour in the moulding department, and we're expecting, I'm just looking back at it, 5,904 hours of labour in the extrusion department. So the figures at the top there. Okay, marvellous. You pop them into your computer. You've got the overheads on the top, you've got the labour hours on the bottom, and I can see on the screen 2250s, 2480s, 2280, 24. Oh, there's a little bit of a difference there. There may be a recovery coming at some point. Okay, yeah, 2250, 22, great, fantastic. When you pop these into your computer, this one should come out at 2250, and this one should come out at £24.80. Just be careful and make sure that you round to the 2 decimal places. Okay, and in this case it's always going to be the nearest. So great. Those are the 2 alternative measures for that. All right, so again, you know what we're saying here is what's going to happen is the management accountant is going to lock these figures in, whichever is right. It can't be both of them, but nonetheless, you know, the management accountant will lock these figures in. Maybe it's the 7230, the 6810, maybe it's the 2250, the 2480. And he's going to include in the management accounts a cost of production, which, if you like, is an estimated figure because it's based on budgets, of course, for every, well, depends, machine hour or labour hour of activity that actually happens. Okay, unfortunately, because we can never ever foresee the future with crystal ball clarity, there's going to be a difference between what we end up with after the management accountant has been fiddling around and what the actual cost of those overheads were. Okay, and that's what the next task does then. It's going to look at this over or under absorption position. So it says at the end of Q1, so all of this other stuff was before the quarter started, remember, budgets. At the end of Q1, it was found that the actual overheads incurred in the moulding department, so we're going for moulding, were 133,154. Okay, we are being told that, because obviously there were 2 different ways of looking at it, they were using a machine hours basis, which for me is the least relevant, but nonetheless, that's what we're told. And the machine hours actually worked were 10% more than budget. Okay, so I'm just going to do a computation before I read the question and do the execution of it. So the machine hours in the budget, I've forgotten, and it's plastic moulding. Excuse me. So the machine hours in the budget were 1,800. Thank you very much, Valerie, for doing that and saving me from coughing and spluttering. And the actual, okay, so these are hours, the actual was 10% more than the budget. So obviously 10% of that, 10% is 180, isn't it? So the actual figure was 1,980 hours. Great. Now, another question, they might just tell you these figures, you know, outright. This one, obviously, it wants us to see what actually happened. So the question says, complete the following sentence using the appropriate response and inserting the correct amount. Now, I should really have given a choice here, but basically we're going to be choosing from, because I didn't include it on there, it's either going to be under absorbed or it's going to be over absorbed. Those will be the 2 choices by, and of course that's an amount that's going to pop into here. All right, so what do we do? Well, this is what the management accountant did, remember. So the management accountant does some absorbing. So I'm going to write this as overhead absorbed. This is what he will have done. Okay, and I'll do it in a different color so it stands out. The management accountant will have said, right, every hour of machine time in this department, 1,980 of them actually, every hour that elapsed, every hour of machine time that machines were running, he will have said, I'm going to put into our costs a figure of, and I've forgotten what the number is, I need to just look back, and of course here it was, £72.30 per hour, remember? So based on the budgets, we're saying for every hour of machine time in this department, we will account for a cost of £72.30. That's the amount of flour or batter being uplifted, if you like, given the actual hours. And I need to work that out as a figure, of course. And someone has just done it for me. Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, Rosie. 143,154. And this is in the P&L account as a cost of production. And when I say P&L, I'm talking about the management accounts, but at the end of the day, fine. Let's just say, you know, there's a cost being racked up because of that computation. What I then need to do, you could say, but actual overhead. So the real cost, if you like, was, and the figure given in the question was 133,154. Now that probably feels good when you see those numbers alongside each other, because of course, bottom line, it looks very right. It sits there beautifully. And so, just using my ruler because I want to, I can put a line there, can I not? Oh, look at that for clarity and loveliness. Okay, away it goes. So the difference between those two numbers is quite clearly £10,000. Rosie, great. I should use it more. Shelley, yeah, I should use my ruler more, but you know, I don't do that very much. So I can see coming up the screen now on my chat panel, overabsorbed, 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 because yes, we've put in a cost of 143,154, but the actual cost is only 133,154. So again, you can see we've put too much in. This is too much, and therefore we call that over absorbed by 10,000. And so that's what we'd be looking for to drop into here. Obviously over absorbed, and 10 grand would be the figure going into your value box there. Marvelous. And that's typically what they're going to ask you about, this process. Now, do just watch out, because the word absorbed, sometimes they also refer to this as recovered. So you might see them talk about sort of the overheads recovered and like a recovery rate, but 99% of the time they're going to talk about an absorption rate rather than a recovery rate. But bottom line, you know, we're talking about the same thing. All right, marvelous. And again, when I say recovered, you know, I skipped past it just a second ago, but you see it there. Overheads are recovered on a machine hours basis. That is absorbed. Same phrase, same meaning. Well, not same phrase, different word, same meaning. Okay, so don't be put off by that, indeed. Okay, nice. Let's have a look at another one. Let's check it through. So the next task we had, second one for this stuff. Okay, again, same bits, same idea, same business, it would appear, same molding and extrusion. But what this does is it just shows, you know, how the same stuff can be presented slightly differently. So this one says, here's information for quarter one, but you've got budgeted, 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 same as before. And of course, you've got actual, actual, and actual. All right, not all given in a table last time, but spread across the different, but you had the same kind of information last time, just a different way of laying that out. Okay, and of course, you can see that I'm using lots of yellow and green. Now, I am from Norwich, and of course, Norwich City won at the weekend and have been crowned champions of the championship, which is why I'm using yellow and green, of course. Apologies if anyone's not a football follower, or indeed anyone is from Ipswich, which is probably not the favourite topic for discussion. But there we go. Same stuff. A, the budgeted overhead absorption rate, 2 decimal places, for plastic moulding department based on labour hours. So just playing you around, plastic moulding on labour hours, and extrusion department based on machine hours. Oh, beautiful. Well, of course, no reason why that couldn't be the case. Okay, so again, we got the computation. So what do we got? It's again budgeted overhead absorption rates. So what do you reckon? What have you guys got for those? Plastic moulding, I'm seeing at 22.50, extrusion 43.25. Rosie's gone for certainly one of those. And I'm just observing the old chat panel. 43.25 looks to be good. 22.50, 43.25 is certainly popular amongst the audience here. Great. You certainly would be an audience that I would trust if I was on, I was going to say I'm a celebrity, get me out of here, but not that. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Okay, so away we go. What do we got? So let's just double check those computations. It's budgeted, so I want the budgeted overheads, 93,375 from the table, this row, whatever it is there, and 225,765 on the extrusion side there. We're using labour hours, so again, budgeted labour hours for the moulding, and budgeted machine hours for the plastic extrusion. For Norfolk people, that's extrusion. So great. I've now forgotten the figure. There it is, 4,150 of those budgeted labour hours. And on this side, I'm just checking the figures again, 5,220 of those budgeted machine hours. Great, which I concur will give you £22.50 to 2 decimal places, of course, for the plastic moulding. And on the plastic extrusion, this sum here does indeed give you £43.25. Great, those are the figures, what we should get in it. Now, actually, just going back to a comment that I made before, this one is now saying plastic moulding lets use labour hours. And if you look at the numbers in the budget, you can see there's a lot more budgeted labour time than there is machinery time. So, I'm kind of liking that question better than the last one. And then in the plastic extrusion, I know it's not hugely disparate, but again, we see here the anticipation is more machine time in extrusion than labour time. So maybe machine hours are the best way to do it. And then you see there, doesn't that look right? That just feels better. Great. Okay. Then we move on to part B. If the absorption rate for plastic extrusion, okay, so now it's going over here and it's saying is £44 per machine hour. Now, that for me is really naughty, because you'd immediately then look over here, and you say, well, have I got it wrong? So don't be swayed by anything like this. You do your work and then just take the figures they give you and use them. Okay, that says that they're near enough. Why they choose to do this, I do not know. You just got to take what they say. Do not be swayed. They're not going to give you the answer that they want in a previous box somewhere else. What they should have done is just completely made up something wayward. But anyway, if the rate for extrusion department is £44 per machine hour, so they're saying this is our budgeted OAR. Great. The actual overheads are 250. So why are you telling me this when it says up here they're a completely different figure? Why they do this, I do not know. You can see my irritation, but there we go. So 250 grand, and the actual machine hours were 5,900. You know, again, why are you telling me that when these figures are all different? At least I can see, I guess, that I shouldn't be worried about the 44. You see what I mean? They're just using random data. Okay, it says complete the following table. Overheads incurred. So when we talk about incurred, this is the actual overheads. Okay, and of course you can see that figure. That's the 250k. Elaine is on there. Overheads absorbed or recovered. Now, again, that's based, of course, they might use that word recovered as well, as you saw in the previous question. But this is the management accountant who'll be using this predetermined number for each machine hour that is being operated in this extrusion department. Now, I see a figure there of 229,680. Are we sure about that, Elena? 229,680. Rosie says 259,600. So there's a difference there. I wonder where the next person's going. Laura is the same as Rosie. Margot's the same as Laura's the same as Rosie. Rosie's done a computation as well. Nice one. Victoria is the same as Rosie, is the same as Margot, is the same as Laura. Let's have a look and see what that one is about. Okay, I can see another one coming in as well. Claudine, Victoria, Zara, everyone agreeing at 259,600. Yeah, so the management accountant is going to sit there and is going to absorb for every machine hour, and the actual machine hours are 5,900. For each one of those is going to include in the management accounts cost of production an amount of overhead based at £44 per hour. And therefore, I agree, concur with that later figure, 259,600 is the amount. Okay, 259,600. Okay, which of course means that that is in our P&L as a cost because of what the management accountant has done. The actual costs are 250. So we're under or over absorbed. Obviously, we need a value and a word. I don't suppose the value is necessarily difficult because the difference in those two numbers is 9,600. And I see Rosie says it's over. Zara's 9,600. Valerie says over. Sweet. Over. Claudine. Laura's over. Ramesh over. Yep, indeed. I concur with an over absorption. What we've put in the P&L account at this stage as a cost is greater than the actual cost itself. So they'll need to do an adjustment, but the concept is a position that is known as over or under absorption. Okay, great, fantastic. Then, and again, you'll see the irritation. So complete the following sentence by selecting appropriate response. So again, it's under, over, or, and the amount that goes in. Now they're talking about Q1. And so now they're saying that I'm not going to give you any further detail. So what they're saying here is you've got to go back to this table then, where we did in fact give you actual figures and budgeted figures. And so, you know, you see my frustration is that this part B is really nothing to do with anything else in the question. Part A is from the stuff at the top. Part C is from the stuff at the top. The bit in the middle bears no resemblance to any of that data. But you've got to just do what they ask you, of course. Okay, so down at the bottom here, we're saying plastic molding department. Okay, so if I can just remind you the plastic molding department, this side, okay, we are looking at actual overheads of 96.5 grand. That's the actual overheads. And you will remember also that plastic molding was based on the labor side of things. Okay. And so at the end of the day, we need to look at the actual labor hours. And then we're away. So I'm hoping that what you did when you had a look at it was to say, right, what has the management accountant done? He will, she will have absorbed or recovered for every labor hour. So overhead actually absorbed. For every labor hour, let's change the color, the actual labor hours in the table, 4,250. Let me just slide it back to confirm. The actual labor hours for molding, 4,250. Boom. And using, of course, the rate, what we computed before, the molding department, the actual budgeted overhead absorption rate was £22.50. So our management accountant has effectively notched up, recorded a cost in these management accounts of, well, 2250, 4,250 times. There it is. I can see it. Thanks, Rosie. 95,625 quid. Okay. Boom. Correct. But the actual overhead, in fact, again, I'll just scroll back because I can't remember the figure. The actual overheads were 96.5 grand. So the actual overhead is 96,500. Okie dokie. And so the question is, of course, what's the difference? Boom, here comes said ruler from before, just to keep it nice and tidy. There we go. The difference between those two numbers is a figure of 875. And of course, we now need to decide whether we've done too much, so we've overabsorbed it, or we haven't done enough, so we've under. And so in our P&L account, the accountant has put in a cost of 95,625, but the actual cost is 96.5 grand. So hasn't put in enough. If we haven't put in enough, we have under absorbed. Boom, shakalak. There you have it. 875 quid is the difference. So the number going in there is 875. And when you click on that button, of course, there, you are going to select the under absorbed. It will say under absorbed there, of course, on the basis that there's nothing else there. Great, fantastic, super. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. And for exceptionally good measure, we have a third question this week, which again says, let's look at a different way of asking you the same stuff. Molding and extrusion, budgeted overhead, budgeted direct labor hours, budgeted machine hours, budgeted, great. So we're back to that kind of thing again. And, you know, just a different layout, I guess. So this time we've got to select a correct answer. So, okay, I'm going to call these A, B, C, and D. What would the budgeted overhead absorption rate be if this was based on them being heavily automated? So, again, hopefully you've had a chance to have a crack at these. I see that Elena is suggesting D, Rosie is suggesting D as well. Heavily automated, of course, is a reference to machine hours. So Elena is showing where the suggestion of D comes from. Zara confirming machine hours, all good. And so obviously just make sure you can see that the things are in a different order. You get a different answer if you accidentally took the machine hours as the overhead and the overhead as the machine hours. That would cause a slightly incorrect calculation, which no doubt you'd spot because it's nowhere near any of these. But yeah, we are looking for plastic moulding, 325,996 of overhead. And we're going to be heavily automated. We'd be using the machine hours. So 5,258 hours. And on the extrusion side of things, 178,200 quid being spread over 3,300 hours. And when you pop those into your pooter, I think it's right in saying that that one comes out to be £62 and our friend over here comes out to be £54. And so we check it out, and what we see, of course, is that D is the correct response in that one. Boom, fantastic, excellent, super, smashing, lovely and nice. Same thing, different format of the question. What is it now if they're based on them being labour intensive? A, B, C or D? Valerie's going for A, Claudine is going for A. So you've seen the process, we know what it's about, don't we? So the overhead cost here is 325,996 and on this side 178,200. The difference, of course, in the two questions is the basis of activity. We're now talking about labour hours, okay? And so away we go. Oh, would I show the figures? Sorry, did you mean those there, Zara? You couldn't see them? Cool, no worries. So I'm about to pick out these ones then for the labour hours, 16,300 and 9,900 as the basis now of activity, of course, for that budgeted overhead absorption. Great. So 325,996 divided by 16,300 hours here, and when we look at the other one, it's 9,900 hours, 178,200, 9,900 hours. Cool. You pop those into your computer. This one then comes out, I think, at around about 20 quid. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this one comes out to be, correct me if I'm wrong, around about £18 per hour. Okay, perfect. And therefore, this time we would select that. Now, if it asked me another question which said, which of these do you think is the most appropriate? Is it the machine hours or the labour hours? Well, have a look at it. You know, have a look. It looks to me very much like if you were looking at whether it's capital intensive or whether it's labour intensive, the answer is sitting there, isn't it? 16,300 labour hours are expected, but only 5,258 machine hours. So maybe that department is pretty much centred around labour, you know, sort of hands-on, proper manual stuff. And so is this one, comparing the two. But obviously they may be different, which the second question did. And I quite like that. So, you know, maybe they'd ask here, which might be the more appropriate based on the activity budget numbers that you can see. All right. So again, you know, they might bring that into it. At the end of the quarter, actual overheads were found to be 315,906 for the moulding, 198,100 for the plastic extrusion. Now, this is slightly peculiar Because it says, assuming that exactly the same amount of overhead was absorbed as budgeted, i.e., when you applied the actual hours, and we don't know which way round it is because they're not telling us, but when you looked at the actual whatever hours we were looking at and you applied it to the 62 or the 54, the 20 or the 18, again, they're not being precise. They're saying the figure that you get in terms of what the management accountant has absorbed, coincidentally, are exactly the same as the budgeted figures, i.e. those numbers there. So, you know, great. It's highly improbable it would come out to be exactly that. But there you go. This question says, I'm telling you it is. So if these are the actual figures, what are we looking at? Overabsorption, underabsorption. What are the figures? Again, sticking with A, B, C, and D for chat panel purposes in it. Valerie's going B, Elena's going B. When you say, are you looking at B wrong? Are you saying B as in B or B as in B? Shelley, I'm not sure when you're saying you're looking at B, are you looking at it wrong? I really can't tell. So that one there, no worries. So the bit that's on the screen here. So hopefully you're not looking at it wrong. Yeah, 178,200 divided by 9,900. I have literally today do not have a calculator in front of me, but pop that into your calculator. You should get £18. Okay, so that's this. Yeah, so that's that one there, isn't it? 18 for that side, 20 for the other one. Is that okay? So again, you may have just missed something, perhaps in the discussion. All right. Okay, no worries. Okay. So then, as we said, as we move into C, they're not actually committing to whether it was labor hours or machine hours or anything like that. Okay. They're just saying, right, okay, just assume what the management accountant has ended up with just happens to be exactly what was budgeted. And then we're comparing to these actual figures. And so I'm seeing B as the most popular, which is an overabsorption of 10,090 by the moulding and underabsorption by 19,900 for the extrusion. Let's have a look. So I'm going to have M and E. Me. I think that in text language, that's something these days, isn't it? I'm way too old for that. Me. So this is what's been absorbed. Okay, we're saying by the management accountant into the P&L without giving us any way of calculating anything. They're just saying assume what the management accountant ended up with was exactly the overheads that were budgeted. So basically the overheads that were budgeted were 325,996 and 178,200. So okay, 325,996. Oh, I've forgotten the other one. 178,200. So that's what they ended up with. Highly improbable, but that's what the question says. So that's what they ended up with. We've then got actual figures. So this one's 315,906, and this one is 198,100. Boom. Last time this evening, potentially. Let's get the ruler out. Boom. There we go. Au revoir. The difference between these two numbers is indeed £10,090. The difference between these two numbers is 19,900. Of course, you've got to look at them. The accountant has bunged in 325,996, but there is actually only 315,906. So on the left-hand side, perhaps I should do it underneath. The accountant has overdone it has put too much in, whereas on the other one, the accountant has put in the P&L account a figure that is less than the actual, hasn't done enough, so is under. So we're looking for over by 10,090, under by 19,090. And the correct response, therefore, would be B, if you know what I mean. It would be B. Okie doke. And you're going to get something along those lines asking you basically about budgeted overhead absorption rates and then looking at actual activity and the resulting position that we may have put too much in and would need to adjust it, or we haven't put enough in and would need to adjust that. Okay. I'm not going to spend time now going over one other point, okay, but I will reference you towards it. I would recommend that you have a look, but not at any really heavy detail, but just make sure that you know of and appreciate a thing here called ABC, activity-based costing, okay? Activity-based costing. So you will have something on this in your materials, wherever it is that you've been studying. You're not going to ask you for really heavy detailed computations with this, but there is a conceptual requirement that you need to just appreciate what it is. Now, just a second ago, we looked at taking overheads based on activity and including them in the cost. So activity-based costing is really just a form of absorption costing. It's doing the same thing, because what we do in absorption costing, we've just done it, is we've looked at a department and we've then said, okay, right, we're going to pass our units through that department, and the overheads of that department would be absorbed, the flour, the batter, or whatever it was, based on a single overhead absorption rate. So the extrusion would have been perhaps machine hours. The molding might be based on labor hours, but basically the overheads of a department or a cost center absorbed on the basis of a single absorption rate. All ABC does, activity-based costing, is it tries to split it down even more. And it says, okay, I don't want to look at one amount. I want to look at lots of different ways of absorbing the costs. And so rather than sucking it up just in, if you like, one number, how many hours was it in on the machines for? We're going to break it down into greater detail. So we talk about cost pools. So this overhead could be for extrusion, but we start to look at what it is that drives the costs in that department. So maybe costs are linked with how many times you have to set up a production line before you can start it to produce stuff. And again, we mentioned repairs and stuff like this. Maybe certain machinery has more repairs and maintenance associated with it. And then there's things like the supervisor, etc., etc. And all we're trying to do is, rather than having one figure to suck it up based on labor hours or something like that, we're going to say, right, let's take the cost, which would have been one figure, and split the overhead cost into pools, and then let's absorb them on individual bases. So per setup, per machine hour, per labor hour for supervisory labor, and things like this. So in effect, what activity-based costing does is just gets into the nitty-gritty and says, assembly, you've got some figures. Let's break those down into what drives those figures. The painting department, whoa, it's going all over the place there. Let's break it down and look at what drives those figures. So rather than having one assembly figure divided by one activity measure, you have 3 assembly figures and 3 activity measures. And so it's just trying to be a little bit more realistic at the end of the day, in terms of the fact that, well, lots of things are not necessarily based on time, you know. So again, the number of times you set some system up, you have to reset the production line at a cost. Great. So, okay, how many times do you need to do that? It doesn't really matter how long things are on the production line necessarily. It's the setup that is the main driver of the cost. So how many times do we do that? Okay, so different bases. Bottom line, whichever one you do, at some point, these costs will get absorbed into your production. Arguably, of course, the more accurate you can be with it, the better. And as I said, basically, you know, it's just the same thing. This is, if you like, the standard model. Yeah. And this is your bells and whistles model. Excellent. Superb. That's kind of the thing. Nice. Okay. So just make sure that you've looked at that. I'm not going to spend the ages on it now, of course, but look, just make sure you've had a look at the concept so you understand it is nothing more than just a deeper dive into the detail of a standard single absorption rate basis. Okie dokie. There you go. That is the basis of task number 5. Next week, we are moving on. We'll be looking at task number 6 in the exam. So again, you know, great if you're with us still next week. Hopefully you will be able to join. If you've got your exam next week, please do email me, let me know how you've got on with it. As I said, I do like to receive information from you as you go off and do that. And great, you should receive the recording link for this session at some point tomorrow, and it will also have, of course, the tasks for next week attached to it. So here we go. I'm just going to pop my face back on and say thank you very much for your time this evening. Hope you found it useful. I'm about to stop the recording, so if you want to, you can unmute and say hello if you wish, but otherwise I will see you next week. So keep safe, keep well, and relax. MMAC is sexy and fun.